Let's go through California's cap and trade program in this episode. Very briefly, the main components of the program, the basics, a little bit of how the trading program actually works, some of the key defining features as well. So that's what we cover in under 10 minutes today. Starting with a bit of history and context, right? What is a cap and trade program? Any country or state in this matter that wants to reduce emissions can go for a cap and trade program, which essentially in simple language is, say your emissions today is 10 million tons of carbon per year. You have a target to reduce your emissions by 20-25%. How do you do that? One of the ways is a cap and trade program where you cap the amount of emissions and you can choose which industries, which sectors come into it. And say of the 10 million tons, you decide, okay, I want it to be 7 million tons by 2025. And then you cap it. And then what you do is you look at each of the sectors, see which sector can reduce emissions, which cannot. They'll have some restrictions or the other. Why they won't be able to make those changes quickly, especially if you need to make long cycle investments. If you run a lot of coal plants to power your economy, you probably can't make that change within a year, but give it 5 to 10 years, the market signal that the cap and trade program brings, you can make those changes. We'll go through some more details around it as we go through this brief, but just an introduction on what a cap and trade program is. With regards to California's cap and trade program, it started in 2013. It was actually formed by the AB 32 legislation in 2006 when Governor Schwarzenegger was in power. What does it cover? Economy-wide, so the power sector, transportation, industrials, fuels, and it covers about 85% of California's market, which is pretty comprehensive given the state of today's market, where certain geographies, there is 0% coverage. So 85% of California's market. The compliance period is 3 years. So back to the original example, say, emissions for the power station is capped at a certain amount. You have 3 years to comply. So it's not at each year you need to be above or over your cap. It's the totality over the 3 years that gets counted. And at the end of those 3 years, if you either emitted above the cap, then you have to procure additional carbon credits. If you emitted below the cap, you have to sell those carbon credits. You don't have to sell. You can bank them as well. We'll get to that later on as we go through some of these details. But it's a good thing to be able to sell excess credits because those credits are quite expensive. It started at $10 a ton, US dollars a ton to trade, and then each year it's been going up by 5% and CPI inflation. The other thing to note is that every ton needs to be accounted for within California, and then the carbon allowance is matched with each of those tons of carbon. There are 4 quarterly auctions that have happened since November 2012. And the way to think about these auctions is you've got a primary market, the first market where certain industries get carbon allowances. So, you might think, why would certain industries, certain sectors get carbon allowances? And the way to think about it is, say you're operating a business in the power sector or transportation, aviation, for instance. In the power sector, you already have units. You've got X amount of coal plants, X amount of renewables, X amount of natural gas plants. You cannot all of a sudden, because there's a high carbon price, turn off your coal plant, right? You need time to do that. And what free allowances helps do is it helps these industries that have already committed with long cycle assets to make that transition easier. And it also makes sure that some of these industries don't, directly just pass that cost to the end consumer, because that would really push up prices, bring up inflation, and not be a nice thing for any economy, especially in this carbon emissions reduction pathway. The other thing to note as well is, aviation, steel, other industries. California has a carbon cap and trade system, but it shouldn't really disincentivize industries that operate there, right? You can't be in a position where industries move out of California. All it does is what, the carbon world, we say carbon leakage, essentially, because, it is still being emitted in a place where there's no emission control. You'd much rather have it being emitted in a place where there is visibility, there's a cap on carbon emissions. So that's where some industries also get free allowances. So that's the primary market. Secondary market is what we discussed earlier. You can trade between companies within the system, within this cap. Those who have excess can give to those who have a deficit, and that's a market-linked mechanism. One thing to note here is if you have excess carbon allowances, you can bank them, i.e. you can, in some instances you can carry them forward to other years. However, if you have a deficit this year, i.e. you over-emitted and you need more allowance, you cannot, borrow from the future. So you can bank them, you can carry it forward, but you cannot borrow from the future, which is an interesting mechanism within this program, because otherwise you would have incentives to just borrow from the future, not comply. So that's an interesting element of it. The other thing that's also of note is maximum holding. So any entity is only allowed to hold 11.2 million tons per year. And just to give you context, the entire California traded market's 300 million tons per year. And the global emissions per year is around 41 gigatons. So that's, just to give you context of where those numbers stand. But that's about it in terms of the key basics of how this market works. There's one final thing on unsold allowances, right? So in these auctions that I've mentioned since November 2012 that we've had around 4 quarterly auctions, if these excess emissions are bought to auction and they don't clear because the price in the secondary market is below the auction reserve price, the minimum price, they won't put those emission allowances back into the market, because you keep a minimum floor, which is good, because it ensures that there aren't certain sectors that completely can acquire emissions at very low prices and continue to emit. And what the system does really well is, if that's the case, they won't release it into the market. And two auctions as well, they'll watch and see if the price goes above the minimum price. If it doesn't, it's permanently cancelled, taken off the system, which is a great mechanism economically as well to ensure that the cap and trade system performs well and regulates the economy and emissions as needed. So, that's a basic on California's carbon emissions, the cap and trade program. Hope you enjoyed it.